All right, we're recording this session, so once again, good morning. I hope that you're all well today and ready to tackle our next reading, which is one of the most famous readings, actually, in philosophy. But before we get there, just a quick housekeeping announcement. Yes, for those of you in my section M that meets on Thursdays, yes, the essay is due midnight tonight. That's correct, Hao Hong. The portal is open, and many of you have already uploaded your essays, and I've actually begun to grade them and comment. So that's just my section M. The majority of you overwhelmingly have your own breakout instructors and your own course requirements as far as assignments are concerned. Okay. Another housekeeping announcement that pertains to everybody in this case is our lecture schedule, and I just want to remind you that we have, of course, regular classes this week, and also regular classes next Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday. The Thanksgiving break begins after that and incorporates the following weekend, not this weekend, but the next. But we're going to meet regularly as we're scheduled to do. So there will be a plenary class next Monday, which will be the 22nd of November. We're going to meet as scheduled. And then we will meet with my group on Thursday, holiday or not. I'll be meeting with you. And those of you who want to take the Thanksgiving on Thursday are welcome to do so, entitled to do so. But I'll be covering material and recording it, so you'll have the opportunity asynchronously to view anything that you might miss. Okay, so that's basically our housekeeping, and then we'll just continue forward with the published schedule that's in your folders and that we've been following all term. So this week is a normal week. Next week we meet on Monday. It's not a holiday. Our Thursday class with Section M falls on the Thanksgiving break, but again, consistent with our format, and in order to stay in sequence with these plenaries and breakouts, I'll be giving a lecture on the Thursday morning of next week, in addition, of course, to this week's lecture. And those of you who will be on Thanksgiving holiday can view it asynchronously as it will be recorded. Okay, so those are the housekeeping issues. Any questions about that before we proceed? Okay, so everybody understands we stay on this track, and let's go forward. So this morning we are going to look at St. Anselm and an argument that he calls the Ontological Argument. It's very shocking in a certain way, very surprising, very creative. It's one of the most interesting arguments of a logical sort in the history of Western philosophy, because it purports actually to do something that no one really believes can be done, namely to prove the existence of God. Now, whether you believe in God or not, there is, to my knowledge, no proof of God's existence. Religion, I'm sure if you think carefully about it, you may agree that religious belief is a personal thing, although it may be shared by a community of believers, but in the end, your religion is your personal belief, and if you believe in God, then it's about your relationship with God and with God's commandments, perhaps, and God's teachings as you conceive God to be, or as your tradition does. But that this is a matter of faith, and that people who basically lose their faith will, of course, lose their religious convictions. Is it not so? I mean, it's a kind of rhetorical question. So if you say you believe in God, then it is virtually synonymous with asserting that you have faith in God's existence. Yes, belief in or faith in this case, mean approximately the same thing. Whereas if you don't believe in God, or if you're an agnostic and you're not sure, it means that you don't have faith. But in no case does anyone offer anything that could be considered an airtight or a completely incontrovertible proof that God exists, or for that matter, does not exist. And the reason for that is simple to state. People use words often in very fuzzy and or even inaccurate ways or misleading ways in common speech, because language is elastic and malleable, and people use words to mean all kinds of things. So you may hear the word proof tossed around in the media, which may mean something they want it to mean, but in philosophy, a proof of something is a much more rigorous kind of argument. And we really only speak of proof in a technical way if we're speaking of logical or mathematical theorems. So a proof, therefore, if it's a valid proof, valid argument, means it's logically valid, it will pertain not to the whole wide world. Proofs will generally pertain to the internal consistency of logical or mathematical arguments. So a proof is very powerful on the one hand, but very restricted in a technical sense in terms of what it can actually prove. So I just want to say this is very important to understand, and I'm going to give you some examples of proofs to illustrate what I mean by proof in a technical sense. And then you should see that even speaking generally, science does not prove anything. Science gives us very good reasons to have confidence in certain hypotheses because they can be tested empirically. And so theories are built up over time by an interaction of theory and experiment. Hypothesis and testing of hypothesis. And when we test a hypothesis, we don't prove it true or we don't prove it false. The language that's most properly associated with scientific testing is the language of confirmation or disconfirmation. So we can confirm a hypothesis experimentally, or indeed we may be able to disconfirm a hypothesis experimentally. And note that one disconfirmation, if the experiment is soundly done and replicable, then one disconfirmation is enough to falsify a hypothesis, whereas any number of confirmations never prove it. They just reinforce our degree of confidence that the hypothesis may indeed be true, okay? But it's not a proof. So I hope you understand that the sciences, whether natural or indeed social, don't really prove things in the more rigorous sense that we intend the word to mean. Is this clear to you before we carry on? It's very important to know this. Yeah? Okay, Jesse says it's clear. Is anybody else clear? I hope everybody else is clear. Please let me know. I need your feedback before we get mired in a very interesting exercise, namely the supposed proof of God's existence. Yes, that's right, Jesse. The theory of evolution is widely accepted, not accepted, correct? But it's still a theory in the sense that it gives us gives us a very good explanation for things. But we can't prove natural selection. We can only say that every species that still exists is somehow has underlying characteristics, genetic characteristics that have been selected for, right, by natural processes. That's not a proof of anything. It's actually a truism. It's not survival of the fittest, but survival of the survivors. Obviously, organisms that survive because they're doing something right. We never point to this thing called natural selection as an actual existing entity in nature. It's just a process by which nature seems to operate on what we call phenotypes in order indirectly to select or deselect the underlying genotypes, right? For those of you who are familiar with the neo-Darwinian paradigm. So one incorrection can disconfirm a theory. Sophia, please, we're just speaking now of the appropriate vocabulary. So we don't prove theories. We don't disprove theories. What we do is something parallel to that. We confirm or disconfirm. But your general idea is correct. Sophia says one incorrection can disprove theory, but many corrections still don't prove it. That's right. But you didn't quite say it correctly I mean, you meant it correctly, but it would be preferable for you to say that one incorrect result can disconfirm a theory, right? We're talking about disconfirming. But many correct results, which apparently are predicted by the theory, will not prove it, but will rather give us stronger and stronger degrees of belief by confirmation of what the theory predicts. Is this clear? Okay. Good. All right. So I think we've made some important distinction here between a proof and a confirmation. Confirmation is weaker. And even if you think about this in context, let's say you think about this in the context of a court of law. In a court of law, in a court of, let's say, criminal justice, the prosecution has to what? Has to prove guilt, if we assume we have presumption of innocence, unless people are, of course, tried in the media, which they are daily. People are convicted in the media daily, and people are canceled in the media daily, which is why it's more and more difficult to get a fair trial. But in any case, suppose we are in a fair trial, and what the prosecution needs to do is what? Prove guilt. But there's a caveat. It's not just prove the guilt of the accused. It's prove it how. What is the condition? The prosecution's mandate is to prove the guilt of the accused according to what qualification? Prove it absolutely, or prove it in what way? There's a particular phrase associated with this, which presumably you ought to know. It's called proof beyond what? Proof beyond? Is it too early in the day? Is this the problem? We're having very good, Jesse. Yes, proof beyond reasonable doubt. Exactly right. Exactly right. No, proof beyond reasonable doubt. Not reproach, but beyond reasonable doubt is the legal phrase that's associated with conviction. If a prosecution can convince a jury or a judge of the guilt of the accused beyond a reasonable doubt, in other words, no reasonable doubt can be raised as a criterion of innocence, then guilt is deemed to have been proved. But it's never proved in a logical sense. It's never proved in an exact sense or in an incontrovertible sense. It's only proved within this exclusion from reasonable doubt. But this is why you probably, if you're a defense attorney, you probably want philosophers on your jury, because if you had Descartes on your jury, of course, Descartes can doubt everything about the evidence of the senses, right? So imagine René Descartes sitting on a jury. It would be very difficult for a prosecutor to prove anything beyond a reasonable doubt, because Descartes was really good. Any skeptic can do this, but Descartes, being a radical skeptic, was very good at raising reasonable doubts and maybe even unreasonable doubts. Yeah. So if you're a prosecutor, you don't want a philosopher on your jury, because they're always going to have reasonable doubts, or doubts that seem reasonable to them. If you're a defense attorney, you want philosophers on your jury because they're going to have reasonable doubts about the guilt of the suspect, no matter what the prosecution thinks they're proving, and so you may be more likely to get an acquittal, or that is a verdict of not guilty. Are you getting this? Am I making sense to you, or is it too early in the day to think about these things? So we do use this word proof in legal or juridical context, but again, the standards of proof in a legalistic setting are absolutely far from what we would call standards of proof in a rigorous logical or mathematical setting. Okay? Is everybody fine with this so far? So if you are, then you should already be scratching your heads. Well, then how can we possibly prove something like God's existence? I mean, that is a matter that would seem very far removed from logic and mathematics, which it is. But Anselm, this rather brilliant theologian of the 11th century, did come up with an argument that is so interesting and innovative that it's still being debated today. I'm still teaching it. Students find it fascinating. Whether you believe in God or not is not the point, right? This is totally a separate matter. That's your own faith or, your own doubt. But the proof itself is the thing that needs to be assessed on its merits. as the basis of its rigor, and it has proved so challenging itself that we're going to see on Thursday, and I hope you will in your breakout groups, that many important philosophers, some of whom we've studied this term, such as Descartes and Hume and Kant, they took this up. They were all looking for loopholes in Anselm's proof, because they didn't believe that anybody could prove God's existence, even though, again, some of them, like Descartes and Kant, were believers, right? Hume was an atheist. Kant was a devout Christian. So was Descartes. But that had nothing to do with the soundness of the proof, and they were able to poke what they thought were holes in the proof in various ways. And we'll look at that Thursday. But before we get there, of course, we need to understand Anselm's argument and see for ourselves what he may or may not be proving with it. And that's our roadmap this morning. We're going to look at Anselm's argument and see how it works. Okay, so far so good. I keep checking in with you because I want to make sure that everybody is with it this morning. Are you all okay so far? Yeah, good. All right, very well then. So before we even get to Anselm, I prepared a slide for you, or a couple of slides, just to illustrate something important about the structure of Anselm's argument. We can generally recognize three kinds of proofs. There are direct proofs, indirect proofs, and inductive proofs. These are the three main kinds of proofs that we work with, and Anselm's proof is of the second kind. I want to give you an example of each of these kinds of proofs so that you can be a bit mindful not only about what a proof is or is not, but that proofs do come in these three main varieties. So let's look at a slide. Let me share a screen with you, and we'll have a quick look at examples of these three kinds of proofs, which I hope will be simple for you. Although if you're encountering this for the first time, you may have to think about it, which of course is not a liability in a philosophy class. If you get something new to think about, that's all grist for the mill. So let me share the screen with you if I'm able, and we'll have a quick look at three different kinds of proofs. Again, I'm doing this not to confuse you. If I do confuse some of you, well, I'm sorry. This is just something you'll need to work through on your own time. These slides are up there in your Google Drive folder, so you'll be able to look at it, again and again if you need to. Are you all seeing the three kinds of proofs slide? Could someone say yes if you are?
Yes, we can see it.
Thank you very much. Okay. So the direct proof, and I'll give you an example of each. Direct proofs are most convincing because they go from A to Z, wherever we're trying to get to, they go in a direct way, and we can justify every step. So it's very convincing. A direct proof shows us in a very transparent way how to go from a set of premises to a conclusion, and that conclusion, if the proof is valid, will be indisputable. An indirect proof generally works well in mathematics and logic. It's a tool we need to use at times, because if we're not able to prove things directly, we have a different strategy we can employ. It's called an indirect proof. I'll give you an example of that. It's a little more complicated, and it can be suspect when we use indirect proofs in natural language. They don't often stand up as well. But in mathematics and logic, they're fine. They're just different way of doing things. Inductive proofs, again, work well in mathematics and logic. And some of you, if you're mathematics students, will have seen inductive proofs. Mathematical induction's a powerful tool where direct and indirect proofs are not able to get the result we want. We can sometimes use induction, but it's not reliable in empirical context. We can never reliably generalize from a few particular experiences. That's why we use statistics to try and correlate things. But this is not at all reliable as a demonstration of anything, not in empirical context, only in logical and mathematical ones. So direct proofs work best because each step can be justified. When you do a step-by-step direct proof, you have a justification for taking each step, which is either an axiom of your theory, or indeed it's by a truth-preserving rule of inference. And if you study logic, you're basically studying truth-preserving rules. These truth-preserving rules have the quality that if you apply the rule correctly, you will always be taken from one true statement to another true statement. You will never produce a false statement from a true one. So it's very important to be able to preserve the integrity of arguments, yes? And different systems of logic have different truth-preserving rules. But if they're correctly applied, you can have confidence that by doing so, you will always be going from true statements to true statements. So this is the power of a direct proof. Indirect proofs, I'm saying, can be suspect in natural language, but the general strategy is a little bit counterintuitive. If we want to prove some proposition P, we can't do it directly sometimes, so we have to do it indirectly. How we do this is to assume the inverse, logically the inverse of P, which is not P. Tilde P means not P, right? Or it is not the case that P. So that's the logical inverse, right? If we're trying to prove P, we can assume not P and then deduce a contradiction. So if we can deduce a contradiction in an argument, we know that our assumption must be false. So if not P leads us to a contradiction, then not P must be false. But if not P is false, then not P must be true, right? Because if it's not the case that P is false, then it's not the case that it's not the case that P is true, which means P is true. Okay, that may be a little confusing for some of you, but you should know that in mathematics, a double negation constitutes an affirmation, correct? The double negative, exactly, Ramses. So, the double negation, if you have two minus signs, that gives you the logical equivalent of a plus, yes? And similarly in English, if we say it's not the case, that it's not the case that today is Monday, what we're really asserting is that today is Monday. That's why we avoid the double negative in grammar, usually because it gives back a positive meaning. All right? So some logicians, a very, very small number of logicians, don't like this. I mean, if not P is true, certainly P is true. That's logically indisputable, but it's not a direct proof of P. It's an indirect proof, okay? So this is a little bit less satisfying at times. Nonetheless, there are many theorems that we cannot prove directly, and so we use indirect proofs. It's only in natural language where indirect proof carries less force, or double negations may carry less force semantically, not logically or mathematically, but semantically. For example, let's suppose I say to you that Jane is a hard worker. Okay, so that's an affirmative statement about Jane, right? We're saying Jane is a hard worker. Suppose then I said the logical equivalent, or roughly the logical equivalent, in the form of a double negation. Suppose I said, no one would say that Jane isn't a hard worker. I'll repeat that. No one would say that Jane isn't a hard worker. Well, that may have the same logical force as Jane is a hard worker, right? If I say Jane is a hard worker, that's an easy to understand statement. If I say no one would say that Jane isn't a hard worker, that certainly implies that everyone would say she is, but somehow it's not the same semantically. Do you get this? It's a weaker statement, right? It's not directly saying she's a hard worker. It's indirectly saying that she's a hard worker by saying that no one would say she isn't a hard worker. But it somehow doesn't have the same semantic force. And that would be true in any natural language in which we employ a double negation instead of an affirmation. Okay? So that's the difference, if you like, between a direct statement and an indirect one. Okay. Inductive claims about the world are totally at risk of being confirmed or disconfirmed, but never proved or disproved. If you want to claim that all birds fly, let's say you're an amateur ornithologist, and you go out to Central Park and start observing birds, and it just so happens that every bird you observe is able to fly, so you might want to claim, that all birds can fly. But of course, that claim, no matter how many birds that we see flying, all we need is one disconfirmation to disprove what we're trying to enunciate as a universal law. This is the great danger of making empirical pronouncements, because it may be the case that every bird you've ever seen flies, and maybe you've traveled up and down North America, and Europe, and all birds you've seen fly. And then suddenly you encounter an ostrich. Let's say you go to Africa and you encounter an ostrich, and all of a sudden you've found a bird that doesn't fly. So then you know you can't soundly claim that all birds fly because you have one counterexample, and that's enough. Okay? One penguin. Yes, there you go. One penguin would be fine too if you want to go to the Antarctic. Yes, indeed. So you see the danger about inductive claims. You only need one disconfirmation to disprove them, if you want to use that language, whereas any number of confirming instances never prove them to be true. Is this clear? It's very important, especially for science students. So you've got to be very careful when you make inductive claims about the world. All right, fair enough? Everybody okay with this? All right. Let's quickly look at some examples, and this you could do, again, on your own if you're unclear about them. Here's a very simple theorem out of Euclid. When two straight lines intersect, the opposite angles are equal. You may already know this proof. You may already just be able to say, well, by inspection, it's obvious. But that's not a proof. We have to prove it. We want to prove RTP required to prove that A equals C. These are the angles, right? Angle A equals angle C. Angle B equals angle D. How do we do this? It's quite trivial, but because it's trivial, it's easy. I've left out the justifications. I think you can probably provide them. The first claim we make is that angle A plus angle B equals 180 degrees. What's the justification for that claim? Does anybody know any geometry? Can anybody say why it is that angle A plus angle B is 180 degrees? Anybody know? It's by definition, because a straight line contains 180 degrees. Euclid has already shown this. Okay? That's right. Exactly, Ramses. Okay, similarly, B plus C equals 180 degrees. Same justification, different straight line, but the same number of degrees subtended by it, right? So therefore, we can say A plus B equals B plus C. What's the justification for that step? How can we declare that A plus B equals B plus C? What's the justification for saying that? Anyone? It's an axiom of Euclid. Again, if you go to Euclid, you'll find, yes, it's not because they're both 180, but that's correct in a specific sense. The justification is that, yes, Jeremy, you can call it a transitive property. That's more sophisticated. You could simply say what Euclid said, namely things that are equal to the same thing are equal to each other. This is a very general and concise way of including a huge class of transitive statements of this kind. So therefore, A equals C. And how do we get there? How do we get from, if A plus B equals B plus C, how do we get to A equals C? Anybody? We subtracted the same thing, Ramses. That's right. Well, you could say you canceled it out, which is what you do with your pen. But basically, we were able, with an equation, to add or subtract the same quantity from each side and not change the truth value of the equality, right? So the equation holds. And so we've shown that, and then we don't have to go through it all over again. We could say similarly it may be shown that B equals C. But that's what we were trying to prove, right? That the opposite angles are equal. And so then you get to write QED. Like if you're a painter, you get to sign your work. And if you're a geometer or mathematician or logician, and you prove what you want to prove, you get to say QED, which means quaderat demonstrandum in Latin, which was to be shown. Okay? So that's easy, right? That's clear. That's a direct proof. It's very convincing. And it's also something that can be followed step by step. Now, an indirect proof is not so easy because we have to assume the logical inverse or the negation of what we want to prove, and then we have to derive or deduce a contradiction. That's a little more complex because if you can derive a contradiction, your assumption must be false, and therefore the negation of what you want to prove is false, and if the negation of a negation is false, the affirmation is true, and therefore what you wanted to prove must be true. But that's why we call it an indirect route. Here's a very simple example again. Proof by contradiction. You can find many, many of these in the literature. We would like to prove that if n squared is even, then n is even. You just need a little algebra for this. We would like to prove this. We can't prove it directly. You can prove it by generating a string of even squares and then showing that their roots are even, but a computer can't do this for all numbers. It can only do this for the numbers in its computing range. So what we want is a general proof that it's true for every n, okay? So how to do it indirectly is to assume something that we want to derive a contradiction from. So we'll assume that n squared is even for some integer n, but that n itself is odd. And that's the thing we're going to be able to derive a contradiction from. And we do it with pretty elementary algebra. If n is odd, which is what we've assumed, yes? We've assumed that n is odd, then n must be of the form 2k plus 1 for some integer k. So then we can express n squared in terms of k. Just do the algebra, and you'll get this expression, that n squared must be equal to twice 2k squared plus 2k plus 1, okay? And then you let m equal this thing, so you make a simple algebraic substitution. So now we've been able to show that n squared is 2m plus 1. That's the form that n squared would have on our assumption. But excuse me, if n squared is of this form, then by definition, n squared must be odd. Yes, n squared has to be odd. But there's the contradiction, because we've already assumed that n squared is even. Up here, we assumed n squared is even and n is odd, and now we've derived a contradiction. Okay? We've derived a contradiction, namely n squared is odd. So we know our assumption must be wrong. Our assumption must be false. And if our assumption is false, then obviously this is false. So if n squared is even, then n must be even. Right? That's the way we prove things indirectly, or by contradiction, or reductio ad absurdum, reduction to absurdity, as often these kinds of proofs are called. All right? So that should give you a sense of how we can operate with an indirect proof. And I'm telling you this not because I want to lecture you about proofs, but because Anselm's ontological proof is itself an indirect proof, partly or largely an indirect proof. So this is about the structure of the arguments, okay? Is everyone all right so far? So far. We are, okay. Ashanti, that's fine. Jesse's fine. All right, the usual people are responding. If you're not clear about this set of slides is in your Google Drive folder, and you can, feel free to look it over on your own time. But I want now to move to Anselm and show you in 7 steps how he purports to prove the existence of God, which is quite remarkable. Of course, quite remarkable. So here's how we're going to work this. We need, firstly, to understand the assumptions in his model. There are 2 assumptions that Anselm makes in order for this proof to operate, and I need to explain to you why he makes these assumptions, and you need to kind of, for the sake of argument, go along with them as being reasonable assumptions. And the first assumption, which may not be clear until it's thought about, is that a thing, anything that exists both in the imagination and in reality, is greater than a thing that exists in the imagination alone. This is a very important assumption. So for Anselm, things could exist in the imagination alone, or they could exist both in imagination and reality. Could someone give me an example of something that exists in the imagination alone? Something that's only imaginary but doesn't exist in reality? Any examples of such a thing? Or any examples? Well, Susanna, are you saying an emotion is an example of something that exists in the imagination alone? Is that what you're saying? Well, isn't it the case that people feel emotions? Don't you feel? I mean, happy and sad is not an imaginary thing. Don't you feel it somehow? Well, if you feel it, then it doesn't exist only in the imagination. Okay? If something that you can actually feel is obviously something that's not totally imaginary, maybe psychosomatic. But, I mean, I could support your case. People who have suffered amputated limbs will often complain of what they call pain in that limb, right? Have you heard about this? Or maybe you know somebody who's missing an arm or missing a leg. Not phantom limbs, phantom pain, Ramses. Yes, people experience phantom pain. So they're saying that they're experiencing pain in a limb that no longer exists. So we would then say phantom pain is that kind of pain. It's clearly existing in their imagination, and they're clearly feeling it in their imagination, and maybe they really say they feel it, but the place where they feel it doesn't exist in reality because the limb is missing. So that would be an example. Are there any more simple? Can someone give a simple example of something? An imaginary creature. Yes, Sophie, I like that. You're on the right track. So what kind of imaginary creatures do we find? We can name some of them, right? Can someone name a creature? A unicorn's a very good example. A unicorn is a horse with a horn on it. Well, you're not going to find that. I'm pretty sure inductively you could travel the world. Santa Claus, there you go. Sure, and we have people dressed up like Santa, or a dragon. That's right. So that's good. So these are creatures or beings or things that definitely exist in our imaginations because we can conceive of them, but we will not find them in reality. Okay? Fair enough? Is that fair enough? Now, what Anselm wants to say is that a thing that exists both in the imagination and in reality is somehow greater than a thing that exists in the imagination alone. And this is very important for his argument. And to help explain this proposition, I want to give you a couple of examples and ask you if you think that these examples of things are greater by virtue of existing both in the imagination and in reality, as opposed to the imagination alone. Let me ask you in the form of questions. What would be greater, for example, what would be greater? The meal, the delicious meal that you imagine cooking, or that same delicious meal that you imagine cooking, which you then cook and eat? Which would be greater? The latter. Well, that's what Anselm wants to say, Susanna. So let me ask you again. Suppose you want to write a book. What would be greater, the book that you imagine writing or the book that you first imagine writing and actually you end up writing and publishing so people can read it? What would be greater? The book that you end up writing, Pam. Yes, that's what Anselm wants to argue. And I want to argue, and I think that we can understand the point, right? Well, Ramses, you want to say technically the book we think. If you're a Platonist, you're going to say the ideal book is greater than the book we can make copies of, right? The books that we make are only copies of the ideal book. Now, Plato is excluded from this argument. Okay, I'm like the judge. I'm going to say we're not admitting Plato as evidence. We're gonna let Anselm, run his argument. Okay, so let me ask it a different way. What would be greater? Let's say the relationship that you imagine, or like the perfect relationship you imagine having, or the perfect relationship that you imagine having, and then you meet that person and actually have that relationship. Which would be greater? Meeting the person, right? So you get Anselm's point, right? Jeremy, yeah, the second one. So you get Anselm's point that if you just dream up something, okay, that might be nice, but it's a lot greater somehow if it exists not only in your imagination, but also in reality. Okay? Are we clear? Yeah, well, Ramses, that's you want to give counterexamples, and you can defend that, and I could defend that too, but that, maybe Anselm would say to you, that's because you need more skill in art. In order to draw the thing that you're imagining, maybe you need to refine your artistic technique, okay, or get a computer-generated image on the case so you could actually make it more interesting in reality as well. But if you're going to just be stuck in that counterexample, you're not going to get Anselm's point. And what I'm asking you to do is to understand Anselm's argument, after which you're definitely free to agree or disagree. But before you agree or disagree, surely you need to understand his argument. Fair enough? Okay. So that's the first assumption, that a thing that exists both in the imagination and in reality is greater than a thing that exists in the imagination alone. That's the first assumption in the background of his argument. The second assumption may be easier, or maybe not, but Anselm assumes that God is a thing, and I'm using his words, of which none greater can be thought, which is equivalent semantically, logically as well, to saying that God is the greatest thinkable thing or the greatest conceivable being. In other words, there's nothing greater than God. If you're imagining the greatest possible thing, you can't imagine anything greater than God. Is that fair enough? Whether you're religious or not, by the way. Most religions would say that God is definitely the greatest conceivable thing or greatest conceivable being. In other words, most religions would say nothing is greater than God. Is that fair enough? Okay, sure. That's easier to digest as an assumption. But also note that it works even if you are an atheist. Let's say you don't believe in God, but then you're still going to understand what is meant by God, right? That God is people believe in the existence of this greatest conceivable being. You may not believe in such an existence, but you still understand the definition of God, yes? Okay? Fair enough? So these are the two background assumptions we need in order to run Anselm's proof. And we're going to do it. And I've done for you a bit of work, so you don't have to do it yourselves. I'm just going to quickly stop the share just momentarily. And before we look at my sort of 7-step breakdown of the proof, there seems to be some hesitation. I don't know if you're hearing me still. Could someone please put in the chat room, did you experience an interruption in the audio or not? Because I'm freezing here. I mean, not physically. The video froze a bit, yeah, but if the audio is more important. What I'm saying, Ramses, is if you don't believe in God, you can still understand what people mean when they say God as the greatest conceivable being. Okay? You may not believe that the greatest conceivable being exists, but you still understand what people mean when they say God. All right? Fair enough? Okay, good. So let me show you, just basically remind you where this occurs in your textbook. We are back to the text and the reading. The reading's all over the internet. It's a 1,000-year-old argument, and it's so interesting that people are still debating it in various arenas. They still produce anthologies on Anselm. They still have conferences on Anselm. And as I've said, some of the greatest philosophers in Western philosophy have weighed in on this argument because it's obviously a very interesting argument in the sense that no one really believes, on the one hand, that anybody can prove God's existence with logic, but we're going to do this in 5 minutes. In the next 5 minutes, we're going to do it just by following what Anselm says. So let me just share the screen with you momentarily, just so you can find it in your textbook. I'm showing you now where it occurs. If you want to read your textbook's extracts, the argument itself comes from a larger work that he wrote called the Proslogion. And there are his dates. He's 11th century for the most part, Christian monk, and the text you'll find it here in part 2 of your textbook, St. Anselm, the Ontological Argument. Okay, so you can look at your textbook, or you can find synopses of it online or different translations of it online. He wrote this, I'm sure, in Latin, but it's been translated into numerous tongues. So that's where you can locate the full extract. I'm only going to go over a bare bones outline with you, which will be sufficient to demonstrate the point. And that's what I'm going to share now. Back to the slides. It's really a 7-step argument, and that's what we're going to go over now. So let me just come back to the room and share this with you. Now, when we step through this argument, I guarantee you, some of you are going to get this right away, and it may sort of, as we say, blow your minds. It's really quite ingenious. And when the light comes on, you're going to say that's unbelievable, but it seems to be a proof. If you don't get it right away, you're going to have to think about it. Like many other things in philosophy, they do require some thought. But after devoting sufficient thought to this argument, step by step, if you follow this outline, I'm sure that light will come on, and then you will be amazed at what Anselm is able to pull off by apparently the exercise of logic alone, which common sense tells us he shouldn't be able to do. But here it is. And I'm just running through the structure of the argument with you. Step one, there are two possibilities, says Anselm, and this is my summary. You can read his own words, but my summary is as follows. There are either God exists in the imagination alone, right? In other words, we dreamed up the idea of God, or if God does not exist in the imagination alone, then God must exist both in the imagination and in reality. Is that fair enough? I'm going to poll you at each step. I want to make sure that every step of the way you are with this, okay? So is that clear as an opener, that either God is imaginary or God is not only imaginary but also real? Those are the two possibilities. Is that okay with you? Yes, no, maybe? Yes, okay, that's the first step. So good so far. All right, fine. Step two. Well, step two is trivial because if the second possibility is the case, if God exists both in the imagination and in reality, then of course God truly exists. So that would prove the point, right? If the second disjunct is true, this is a disjunction. When we have either or, each branch of that either or statement is called a disjunct, and the either or itself together is called a disjunction. One thing or the other must be true. So if the second part is true, if God exists both in the imagination and in reality, then obviously God truly exists. Okay, that's fine. But now suppose at step three that God exists only in the imagination, right? So what happens if, in that case, if God exists only in the imagination? This is where Anselm derives a contradiction. And that this part of the proof is the part that's therefore indirect, yeah? If God exists only in the imagination, the greatest conceivable being exists only in the imagination. But remember, that's the definition of God, right? The greatest conceivable being, that there's nothing greater than God that we can conceive. So if God exists in the imagination alone, it's equivalent to saying that the greatest conceivable being exists in the imagination alone, according to Anselm's definition of God as the greatest conceivable being. And we'll get a contradiction from this immediately, because if the greatest conceivable being exists in the imagination alone, we can argue at step four that in that case the greatest conceivable being is not the greatest conceivable being. And why is that? Because if the greatest conceivable being exists in the imagination alone, says Anselm, I can conceive of a greater being. Namely, at step five, the greater being is the one that exists both in the imagination and in reality. So the greatest conceivable being, therefore, cannot exist in the imagination alone. That's the contradiction. I'll repeat it. If the greatest conceivable being exists only in the imagination, then it's not the greatest conceivable being. Why? Because I could think of a greater one, namely the one that would exist in the imagination and in reality. And so, from the assumption that God exists in the imagination alone at step three, we derive a contradiction at step four, and the explicit contradiction is enunciated at step five, and therefore our assumption in step three must be false because we derived a contradiction from it, right? That's the structure of indirect proof. And if the assumption at step three is false, namely the assumption that God exists in the imagination alone, then what must be true? Well, the other branch of the argument must be true, namely that the greatest conceivable being must exist both in the imagination and in reality. But therefore, God truly exists. And that is, in a nutshell, this very famous ontological argument. Okay, now, does anybody get the argument? Does anybody see how clever it is and how he purports to be able to use logic to demonstrate that God necessarily must exist? Now, some of you may... Oh, you're getting it. You got it right away, Jeremy? Yes, it is indeed very clever, Jeremy. That's why philosophers of very high caliber have actually sought to show there's a flaw. And we'll see on Thursday, philosophers like Descartes and Hume and Kant and many others have tried to figure out what's wrong with this argument. Yes, Sophie, I'm glad you find it interesting. It's really quite brilliant and unique. One will not find, I dare say, in the history of philosophy, such a clever attempt to prove by logic the existence of a being which would seem to be outside of logic, far outside of the bounds of logic and into the bounds of religious faith. So Susanna asks, basically, our imagination is too restrictive. Well, that's a way of saying it, but I mean, what Anselm wants to argue is that if God exists only in the imagination, then by definition, that's not sufficient for God to be God, because God is the greatest conceivable being. And we've already, remember that background assumption, it's really important that a thing which exists, the assumption in the background, right, is that a thing which exists both in the imagination and reality is greater than a thing that exists in the imagination alone. We just took many examples of this, yes? So therefore, when applied to the greatest conceivable being, right, the greatest conceivable being could not exist in the imagination alone, because then it wouldn't be the greatest conceivable being. We could think of a greater one, namely one that exists both in the imagination and in reality. So if the greatest conceivable being exists in the imagination alone, the greatest conceivable being is not the greatest conceivable being. That's a contradiction. And so the assumption that the greatest conceivable being exists in the imagination alone must be false. But if the assumption that the greatest conceivable being exists in the imagination alone is false, then it must be the case, concludes Anselm, that the greatest conceivable being exists both in the imagination and in reality, and therefore that God truly exists. I've just, given you an even more brief summary. Well, that's right, Ramses. It hinges on the idea that God has no limits. Of course, of course it does. But he's already declared as a definition that God is the greatest conceivable being. And most religions that have a Godhead would say there's nothing greater than God. All right. Now, if you happen to not believe in God, then you will say, well, this is just an abstract argument. But if you do believe in God, then you're going to say there's nothing greater than God. Anselm's point is, even if you disbelieve in God, the thing you disbelieve in, you would still define as the greatest conceivable being. You would just say, I don't believe in such a being. Okay? Because Ramses, if God has limits, then God is not God, right? We have limits. All mortals have limits, and all things in this world have limits. But supposedly, again, according to religious faith, I'm just saying for the sake of argument, that the creator of those things does not have the same limits at all, or any limits. Fair enough? But you can try. You can certainly try to pick a hole in Anselm's argument by means of challenging his definition of God. Yes, you could say that, but it has to be framed in such a way as to be able not to simply challenge the definition of God, because God, by definition, is a being with no limits. Yeah. So you're by the criticism, if it is one that the argument hinges on God having no limits, of course it does. But Anselm says it's at the beginning. That's one of his assumptions. Okay? Before we get into some of the possibilities of what might be wrong with this argument, and certainly there are a few things that you might want to identify as suspects, I just want to make sure that the first mission is accomplished, namely that most of you, or hopefully all of you before long, understand the argument itself, understand the structure of the argument, and understand the way in which, by this largely indirect method, Anselm attempts to prove that God exists. Is that much clear to you? We're just looking at the argument on its face. Okay, that's good. So some of you are getting this. It's an interesting argument. Some of you already said that. Certainly very creative. Whether you believe or not is not the issue, right? We're looking at the actual integrity of the argument itself. Okay? And then Anselm says something more. I'm going to just introduce one more thing to you because Anselm will use the same definition of God, namely the greatest conceivable being, or being than which no greater can be thought, if you want his slightly more cumbersome version. He's going to say, and he does say in the extract that you have in your textbook, that it's impossible to be an atheist, because the same argument will go through. If there are any atheists in the class, I mean, this is, again, this is a matter of personal conviction or lack thereof. I'm not saying everybody, according to this argument, suddenly has to become a believer. I'm merely trying to explain to you Anselm's logic, and also Anselm's reply to the atheist, which is very interesting. Because an atheist is somebody who, by definition, disbelieves in God, right? Is that fair enough? An atheist is someone who doesn't believe that God exists in reality, right? Okay. So in other words, an atheist would say, most likely, that God is imaginary. God is an idea you cooked up, or people cooked up in their imaginations, and they decide to believe in it. But an atheist would say, I acknowledge the concept of God exists in people's imaginations, but does not really exist in reality. Is that fair enough to represent in general the position of an atheist? Is that fair enough? I'm trying to be fair. An atheist would say that God exists in the imagination alone, but not in reality. Yeah? Okay? Yes, Suzanne. That's generally what an atheist... You go around, if you know any atheists, ask them. And they'll probably tell you some version of the claim, one, that God exists in the imagination alone, right? But God does not exist in both in the imagination and reality. That's generally what atheism means. Okay, but here's what Anselm says, and maybe some of you already see this coming. Anselm is going to say that's a contradiction too, for the same reason, because the atheist is saying that the greatest conceivable being exists in the imagination alone. Right? The greatest conceivable being exists in the imagination alone. But Anselm says, if you're an atheist and you believe that the greatest conceivable being exists in the imagination alone and not in reality, you're contradicting yourself. Because the greatest conceivable being is not the greatest conceivable being unless it exists both in the imagination and in reality. So the atheist is contradicting themselves. Jesse, I don't think it's the case that they believe in the contradiction. You can't believe in a contradiction. I think it's the case that they don't realize that they are contradicting themselves, which is what Anselm is saying about them. You might want to say they believe in the contradiction. But the atheist may not believe that God is the greatest being. Well, but then what are they denying? I think that here I would ask you to conduct the experiment and look up some atheists, or go online and see what the definition of atheism is. Does anybody, I know some of you are very quick on the draw. Why doesn't someone go online while we're talking here and pull up a definition of atheism and plug it into the chat room, okay? If you can find a very simple definition, a very straightforward definition of atheism, okay? Atheism, A-T-H-E-I-S-M, okay? Atheism is without God, literally, without God. The broadest sense, the absence of belief. Okay, there you go. Okay, Ramses, I'll use yours. This one is Jesse's is more complicated, which is also accurate. But this position that there are no deities, specifically in the narrower sense, right? The position that there are no deities. But what that is asserting, just as Ramses pulled up, thank you for your quick action here, a person who disbelieves or lacks belief in the existence of God, right? Okay, that's right. That's what we mean by atheism. But now consider the following. Anselm's reply to this definition is that, but you still understand what God means. You're denying that God exists. Anselm would say, in other words, you are still asserting that God, if God existed, would be the greatest conceivable being, but you're saying, if you're an atheist, that God is only imaginary. Yeah? but you still understand by the definition of God that God is this omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient being, the greatest conceivable being. So if you deny the existence of God, you're denying the existence of the greatest conceivable being, and therefore you're contradicting yourself. If you say the greatest conceivable being exists in people's imaginations alone, but not in reality, Anselm says you're contradicting yourself, because the greatest conceivable being is not the greatest conceivable being if it exists in the imagination alone, because I could think of a greater one, namely that one that exists both in the imagination and in reality. And so the atheist is contradicting themselves. Atheists contradict themselves. And if they understood that, then they would also believe in God. Says Anselm, he says it in a less kindly way. He distinguishes between foolishness and wisdom. In his argument, he says an atheist is a fool, not to be disrespectful or demeaning, but to point out that they're contradicting themselves. Well, Ramsey's interesting. It's somewhat, Ramsey says, somewhat like saying infinity doesn't exist. Well, does infinity exist? I mean, if you claim that infinity doesn't exist, what we're talking about is, of course, not a number, right? We're talking about infinity as a process that, that goes on without end, yes? Increases or decreases without bound, yes? It's boundless, right? Boundless. So can you deny that the boundless exists? I think you can't. And you could use the same argument, in essence, as Anselm's structure. The boundlessness is boundless, and if you assert that boundlessness does not exist, then you're actually putting a bound on it, which would be a contradiction in terms. Don't you think? The difference being, Ramses, one salient difference is that if we talk about an infinite sequence, we can demonstrate a partial sequence that we know to be infinite, or we believe to be infinite. Just the counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., is an infinite sequence. There's no last number, yeah? There's no last number. So if you came up with an ending, if you wanted to disprove infinity by giving the last number, this is the biggest number, you want to say, well, then the disproof of that is that we can just add 1 to it, and goes on. So again, we can do a proof by contradiction. By assuming there's a greatest number, we can say, well, if x is the greatest number, the largest integer, let's say, well, what about x plus 1? X plus 1 is larger than x. So x can't be the largest integer. So there is no largest integer. And that's a proof that infinity exists, okay? As a concept. But our definition of infinity is not a proof that the universe is infinite. It's not a proof that there's an infinite number of atoms in the universe, for example. It's not a proof about reality. It's only a proof about imagination. So discussing infinity is a more restricted thing, but can still be subject to indirect proof in order to demonstrate there's no largest integer, there's no largest prime number. There's a whole string of indirect proofs that all have the same structure that can be used to demonstrate that there's no largest entity of a certain kind mathematically, okay? So it is a bit parallel to that, but when we're talking about mathematical entities, we're talking only about conceptual ones, whereas Anselm is talking about a being that, in order to be the greatest conceivable being, cannot be restricted by definition to the imagination alone. Okay? And that's where the parallel with infinity would break down. All right? So are people clear about why Anselm says that the atheist would be contradicting herself or himself? That if you say the greatest conceivable being exists only in the imagination, then you're contradicting yourself, because then you're not realizing that the greatest conceivable being cannot be the greatest conceivable being if it only exists in the imagination, because you could think of a greater one, namely the one that exists both in the imagination and reality. So you can't really be an atheist. Well, it's not an acknowledgement; it's a definition. So Jesse, if you can think of something greater than God, then that would be God. God is a concept if you like, or a name that different religions have different names for God, right? Yes? But they're all saying, Anselm says, whatever your name is, Anselm was not saying this, I'm saying this, that every religion that has a gods or a god uses a different name for it, or in fact doesn't allow it to be named, but in any case, they're still thinking about that being as the greatest. Yes, there's nothing greater than God. Certainly in the Abrahamic faiths, if you are an adherent to Judaism or Christianity or Islam, certainly you're going to acknowledge that God is the greatest, right? God is the greatest. No question. So you therefore could not assert that God exists in the imagination alone without contradicting yourself. So it is like a paradox, Ramses, yeah. I mean, definitely, if you take the larger perspective on this argument, and indeed it's paradoxical, because one part of our understanding of things says we should not be able to prove or disprove the existence of God with logic, because the empirical world and the supernatural world are domains that range far beyond the precincts of logic alone. Logic is restricted to the internal integrity or validity of arguments, and empirical things are far beyond that range. So how could we possibly be proving that God exists with a seven-step logical argument? That's what's paradoxical, Ramses. The argument itself is not a paradox. The fact that the argument purports to prove the existence of God is definitely, as you say, a kind of paradox, in which case our duty is to figure out where we went wrong, yes? And this is why there's a 1,000-year-old debate where everyone is still, who's interested in this so-called ontological proof, is definitely interested in fingering or identifying where Anselm's logic is faulty, because we find it inconceivable, not that God is the greatest conceivable being, but we generally find it inconceivable that they could prove the existence of such a being by purely logical means, which is apparently what Anselm is doing. Okay? Although I would grant you that it's not purely logical either, because he is, in his logical definition of God, also talking about reality. He does bring in reality pretty early on, and that's one of the important background assumptions. Nonetheless, it is indeed, Ramses, as you assert, paradoxical that logic could prove that God exists. Now, those of you who already believe in God may go home happy today, or be happy because now you think there's a proof. Those of you who are agnostics or atheists, and I'm sure we have some in the class too, are going to say, well, then we need to figure out what's wrong with this proof, because it surely seems counterintuitive to be able to prove such a thing, yeah? So whichever side of the line you're on, if you believe in God, if you don't believe in God, or if you're sitting on the fence, you're an agnostic, you're not sure one way or another, this proof is going to make you think, because there's something going on here which is certainly creative and unusual. Fair enough? So do you have any questions about what we have? You don't really understand it, Brandon? Okay, as I said, some of you will get it right away. Oh, step 6. Well, okay, step 6 is the conclusion that's forced on us by virtue of the contradiction in the assumption that God exists in the imagination alone. Okay? You have to understand 6, you have to go back to 3. 3 is the first branch of 1. If either God exists in the imagination alone, or God exists both in the imagination and reality. Well, if the latter disjunct is true, then God truly exists, as we assert in step 2. But in step 3, we assume the first disjunct to be true, namely that God exists in the imagination alone. That's where you get eventually step 6, okay, Brandon? From step 3, if God exists in the imagination alone, then the greatest conceivable being, which is the definition of God, exists in the imagination alone. But that's the contradiction, because if the greatest conceivable being exists in the imagination alone, then the greatest conceivable being is not the greatest conceivable being. Because at step 5, it's clear that if the greatest conceivable being exists in the imagination alone, you can conceive of something greater, namely a being which exists both in the imagination and in reality. And that's why step 6 asserts what it asserts, because we've succeeded in deriving a contradiction from the assumption that God exists in the imagination alone. Okay? And that's how he concludes that God truly exists. Okay? Well, the reality part, reality, I grant you that reality can be a very confusing place. All right? And there's no question about that. But remember, reality for Anselm means something outside the imagination. He's really talking about the whole world outside of mind. He's being a kind of a dualist, right? Like there's, the world of our thoughts, our imagination, for example, which would be part of the world of mind. I mean, he's 500 years before Descartes, but he's still in his own way kind of a dualist. With this assumption that things exist either in our minds, that faculty of mind, which Descartes calls imagination, and he's not alone in doing so. Things could exist in our imagination, but not in reality, or indeed things could exist both in the imagination and in reality, yeah? So I mean, reality is everything that isn't imagination, in this case. A much larger set of things, perhaps. Okay? All right. So if you are seeing the argument, then you're probably scratching your heads, and that's a good thing, because you're going to be saying, well, how could he have just proved this? It's amazing. It really is. I hope you see how amazing this is, that somebody came up with this proof. It's very creative. I'm sure you'll acknowledge that. Whether you agree with it or not is a different argument, but, the creativity is there. It's brilliant, actually. But if you are in some sort of disbelief that this could actually be a proof of God's existence, then you're not alone. You have plenty of philosophical company. The challenge will be to come up with a demonstration of where does this go wrong, and that's what we're going to look at on Thursday, all the different possible, or at least some of the strongest possible arguments that have been made again, by philosophers whom we've seen in other contexts this term. We've seen Descartes, we've seen Hume, we've seen Kant. All of them have come up with really interesting counter-arguments. Again, whether they believe in God or not has nothing to do with identifying where this proof might be faulty, yes? And if you don't yet see the proof, if you're still scratching your heads about that, then I will ask you to read the extract in your textbooks, because Anselm explains it in his own words. You have a nice translation of it there, or of the salient portions. And I've tried to boil it down for you to make it a little more simple. I don't know if I've succeeded or not, but I've done my best to clarify it. Okay? So are some of you at least getting the main point of today's exercise, which is to understand the structure of the proof? Do you see how he does this? Yeah? Okay. Very well. You're welcome, Ron, my dear friend Ron. Is with us today. As long as you understand the structure of the proof, you're in good shape and you're up to speed, okay? If any of you are still struggling, you're starting to get it, Jeremy, okay, it's good. It's a very unusual argument. It's quite unique in the history of philosophy, which is to say why we're still studying it 1,000 years later. And as soon as that light comes on, as soon as you understand where he's going with this, you're going to say, how did he do that? It's like a magic show. Someone pulls a rabbit out of a hat and everybody wants to know how they did it, right? I mean, they didn't really do it. There must be a trick. But figuring out the trick is not as easy as being entertained by the trick. Yes, we can all be entertained by a magic show if we allow ourselves not to worry about how they did it. We can be entertained by it. But if you really want to know how they did it, then that's naturally a different kind of a problem to solve. And here there's no magic show involved. It appears as though he's pulling God out of a logical argument, which is maybe equivalent to pulling a rabbit out of a hat. But how did he do it is a lot less clear. It's a lot less clear how he did this. But the first step is to understand what he's doing, or what he's purporting to do. And then when that light comes on and you see how he's saying that it's impossible to be an atheist, for example, because you're denying the existence of the greatest conceivable beings, a contradiction in terms to deny it, and so forth. If you get this, then on Thursday in our breakout group, you'll be better prepared to understand not only Descartes and Hume's and Kant's arguments, but also other arguments that have been made, and also a monk of of Anselm's day, Gaunilo, made a very interesting argument already against it, which is in your textbooks. I'll be taking this up in my breakout group, as you will, but just in brief, the monk Gaunilo said, wait a second, he said to Anselm, you can't, and Gaunilo is a believer, right? He's a monk, he's taken holy vows. But he says, by the same argument, if I should believe, therefore, in the existence of the perfect tropical island, by the same argument, Gaunilo says, if the perfect tropical island can be imagined, it must exist in reality, because otherwise it wouldn't be the most perfect tropical island. And therefore, if I can conceive of the most perfect tropical island, I ought to set sail looking for it, says Gaunilo, as a criticism of Anselm's argument. Just because I can dream this up means it must exist. He says that's nonsense. That can't be right. And Anselm says it's only true of God. It's not true of contingent existences like islands, which could have changes to them by virtue of natural processes. God is exempt from that. So anyway, we'll look at this on Thursday, okay? So that's it for today. I hope this was at least entertaining to you, hopefully instructive, and hopefully you will go over this, okay? Oh, Ramses, you're going to declare for your major now? You mean this has convinced you to declare philosophy as a major? Is Anselm actually turned the trick? I'm going to let my chair know about this, because that's a really good reason for us to keep teaching Anselm. If this is what pushed you over the edge, I'm very glad of it. But is this, you're talking about majoring in, oh, no, for computer science. We've traced you away. Okay, all right, I was being an optimist. If we've chased you away from philosophy because of Anselm, I'm also going to tell my colleagues, so maybe we'll stop teaching it. We're trying to attract you, not repel you. But in any case, I hope that you're intrigued by the argument, okay? Whatever your major is, all right? I hope Anselm is making you think. And your question, Naomi, is whether imagining things makes it real, or if we can only imagine things that are real. Very interesting. We'll take that up in our breakout groups. If you have a different instructor, that's a great departure point for you, okay? Thank you so much, everybody. I'll stop the recording here. And I see that some of you are intrigued by this. That's good, for whatever reasons. All right, well, to be continued. Have a wonderful week, everyone. Stay safe and well. And I'll see you all soon. All right? Be well. I'm stopping the recording.